For those of you who are new, my name is Michael, and wherever you find yourself in the world, a very warm welcome to all of you. Now, I'm sure you, like me, have been devastated by the tragic news of hundreds of elephants mysteriously dying in Botswana. When I first heard about the story a couple of weeks ago, I tried to scour the internet for news articles and videos to try and find out more details. And Dr. Niall McCann from National Park Rescue has been interviewed numerous times. I reached out to Niall to ask him if he wouldn't mind sharing in more detail with all of us what is happening, what is unfolding on the ground in Botswana. We're now going to cross over to the UK to Niall. How are you? I hope you're well.
I'm well, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for having me. Very nice of you to invite me on, and good evening, everybody.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I think all of us really would love to have a little bit more detail. We've watched these snippets on news stations of a couple of minutes, and you've been really great at unpacking some of the issues. But this is a real luxury where we get to ask you all the questions that we have. And maybe I could be bold to ask you just to start at the very beginning, to maybe share some light on what is the story with elephants in Africa, and we can go from there.
I suppose, not to put a downer on things, but the story of elephants in Africa is one of tragedy, essentially. If we think way back into historical time, 1500s, 1600s, there were millions of elephants, probably somewhere in the region of 26, 27 million, something like that. It's difficult to estimate, but an extraordinary number, and they were spread right throughout Africa, not only sub-Saharan, but also north as well. Famously, Hannibal used elephants to go across the Alps to try and attack the Romans, and there was just vast numbers. And they've slowly whittled down over the centuries and decades, and the most recent census, which was an extraordinary piece of research, calculated that there's around 415,000 savanna elephants left. So there's others in the forest, in the rainforest, but savanna elephants, there's about 415,000 left. And just to be precise, they're spread across 37 countries at the moment. So we've got 37 countries in Africa with 415,000 elephants, and the most significant population of all is in Botswana. They have about a third of all of the elephants remaining on the continent, which makes that a country of international significance when it comes to conservation. I think this graph that you're showing, it's hard to visualize in your head what 26 or 27 million looks like, but when you see a graph doing that, you know it's a bad thing, and it's pretty awful. So you can see what the population was like back in pre-colonial times, really, and then since then it's just been terrible. But for me, to make it feel personal, if I try and think back to when I was born in 1981, and there were 1.2 million elephants in Africa at that time, and here we are 38 years later, and there's a third of those remaining. So there's 400 and something thousand. So in my lifetime, we've lost 2/3 of all the elephants on Earth. And that's actually an interesting statistic, because in the last 50 years or so, we've lost about 2/3 of all life on Earth. This is a global thing, and elephants in microcosm are explaining what humanity is doing to the planet at large. What this image demonstrates is how it all started. It was a disgusting and exploitative colonial project to empty Africa of its riches. And ivory was one of the most valued commodities across the continent. So you see the two arrogant-looking colonial chaps in the middle and their porters, and just unbelievable quantities of ivory were robbed from Africa and sent to Europe and North America throughout the 17, 18, 1900s, and even into the 20th century as well. And it was all countries were involved. So the Belgian Congo, King Leopold II, who did so many horrific things on the continent. One of the worst things that he did was, well, being the butcher of Africa, emptying it of ivory, just emptying the Congo of its ivory. But the Brits were at it, the Americans were at it, the Italians were at it, the French were at it, all of them were at it. And that continued essentially unabated until the 1970s and 1980s, when people started to realize that this is now totally unsustainable. We're losing elephants at a rate that can't be managed. And in the 1980s, through CITES, which is the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, it's a UN convention, debates started to be had about whether or not ivory should be traded internationally, because it's this international trade, this legal trade, which is allowing the ongoing slaughter. There's a huge demand for ivory in Southeast Asia in particular, but all across the world. Europe, massive demand. North America, massive demand. And it took until 1989 for the parties in CITES to actually agree that actually we need to put a stop to this. And there was a lot of opposition, especially from your SADC nations. So Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, South Africa strongly believe that ivory is a natural resource of theirs, that they have an intrinsic right to be able to trade. And they didn't want an outside organization telling them that they couldn't trade this. And of course, the Chinese and the Japanese in particular, and people in Hong Kong, were hugely enthusiastic to continue that trade because they were making enormous amounts of money out of it at that end as well. So when this all happened, instead of ivory being sold everywhere, countries had to stockpile it because it was no longer legal to trade it. There's been 2 legal trades since that time. And 1 or 2 countries, pioneered by Kenya, taken the approach that ivory should have absolutely no value unless it is on the face of a living elephant. If it's in any other means, it should be valueless, totally valueless. And to demonstrate that, they've burned their incredible stockpiles of ivory. And they've had multiple burnings. This was started by the KWS in the 90s with the Leakeys, and it's been continued on through. There was a burn recently. Malawi's done the same. Various other countries are doing this. And for me, it's a strong demonstration that these countries are saying elephants have a value intrinsically when they're alive. When they're dead, there's no more. And ivory, what they're trying to create is a taboo around ivory, which is difficult to create. Taboos take a generation to set in, but Kenya is pioneering the way and trying to set that in against great opposition from your SADC nations. And it's interesting with Botswana. Botswana knows how much elephants generate for the country. Elephants are a hugely important part of their economy. As the slide here says, ecotourism, there's 2.5 million tourists visit Botswana annually. And the majority of those, they come for the elephants. There's good populations of lion and other wildlife, but people are really attracted to elephants. Chobe National Park and the Okavango Delta, it's elephants that people want to see. It's the second, ecotourism is the second largest generator of GDP in Botswana, 11.5%, give or take. The only thing that's larger is diamonds. So you can think of elephants as being jewels, living jewels, walking around the Okavango Delta and Chobe National Park. And they provide a huge number of jobs to people in Botswana, 80,000 within the ecotourism sector. But there's a lot of controversy as well, and we'll get onto that because not everybody's happy about that number of elephants, and not everybody benefits from that ecotourism. And so that brings us on to this mass die-off mystery, which I'm afraid to say is still a mystery. I'll be able to shed some light on the multiple conflicting hypotheses, but really it's this mysterious, highly confusing event that all of a sudden a very large number of elephants appear to be dying in northwestern Botswana. So where this is happening is in the Okavango Delta. It's a place called the Saronga Panhandle, beneath what was the Caprivi Strip of Namibia, and it's all penned in by the Okavango. That whole area is into concessions, and it's happening in 1 or 2 of the concessions particularly. Very, very near the border of Namibia, also relatively close to Zambia and Angola. And those countries at the moment have not been experiencing deaths, which is quite striking. They're really well contained in an area that's only a couple of thousand square kilometers. And the elephants in there, we've got 356 carcasses confirmed, and those are just the ones that have been seen from the air. And I'm sure many of the people listening have flown over elephant territory. It's very hard to see an elephant from the air. They're enormous, but they're very difficult to see despite being so big. So the fact that they've actually been able to identify and GPS locate 356 in that area indicates to me that the actual total will be significantly larger than that. So back in March of this year, the first rumours started to come out of the area that elephants were dying for no real known reason. There's a couple of local NGOs and also the people. There's a human population of about 16,000 people that live in that Saronga area. And they were noticing elephants that were dying, and they couldn't explain it. Normally, you can explain when an elephant has died. What's happened is quite obvious, but in this case, there was no explanation. And those numbers kept on going up. So it was 4, then it was 8, then it was 14, then it was 44. And alarm bells were beginning to ring sufficiently that some local conservationists did a flight on around the 25th of May. And these reports are all publicly available. And they counted 169 dead elephants from the air in a 3-hour flight. And that's suddenly alarm bells are going off, because that's a significant number of elephants in a small amount of time over a relatively confined region. A month later, it became apparent. So the Botswana Safari News Facebook page has a lot of interesting chatter about what's going on in Botswana and safari world anyway. And on that site, it became apparent that deaths were still ongoing and that there hadn't been sufficient moves to try and identify what was causing them. The samples had been taken originally back in May, but those samples hadn't been sent to any other labs. So there was still a great deal of confusion as to what was happening, and the deaths were still ongoing. And at that point, an American charity, it's Global March for Elephants and Rhinos, they wrote an open letter to the government of Botswana saying, what's happening? We need to know what's going on. This is bad, and the world is interested. But the world wasn't interested then. It was still quiet. It was bubbling away in kind of local news in Botswana, but nothing else was really happening. And then the second survey took place around the 20th of June and identified 356 elephants. And suddenly this is significant. 356 elephants is already just under 1,000 of the remaining population on the whole continent, let alone an appreciable number for Botswana itself. So that's when things started to get a little bit worrying at that point. And it was at that point that the Guardian newspaper in the UK got hold of the story, and they contacted me, and I was able to provide some comment based on the photographs. And over the next 24 hours, the story went absolutely global. And interviews happened from South Africa to Australia to Germany to Austria to the UK, Canada, US, absolutely everywhere. And what that demonstrates is that this conservation is of international importance. The world cares what is happening to Botswana's elephants. And I think that was a real wake-up call for a lot of people in Southern Africa, realizing that conservation isn't just a parochial matter. It's not just a local matter. It's global. And in the age of COVID-19, that's been demonstrated painfully to all of us. A conservation problem, a breakdown in law enforcement and conservation in China, has led to all of us being stuck in our houses for 5 months. So people are starting to realize how tangible international conservation issues are. When the Amazon burns, we all suffer. We're all losing oxygen as a result of that. When the ice caps in Greenland melt, we all suffer. When elephants are dying in Botswana, we all feel it. Everybody around the world feels it. Everyone suffers. And so the story went global. It went twice around the world before we'd even blinked. It's quite extraordinary. Now, one of the things that was really stark about this, which raised questions immediately, was the manner with which these elephants were succumbing to whatever it was that was killing them. You can see in this photograph that elephant has died what we call sternally. It's dropped onto its sternum, straight in front, as you would imagine it would had it received a brain shot. So that's quite stark. This elephant has died mid-stride. It's been walking one moment and the next moment, bang, dead on its front. Whereas other elephants were witnessed suffering ataxia, so really unable to control their motor function. Their limbs weren't working very well. They'd be walking around in tight circles, very, very odd behavior, indicating some neuronal dysfunction, something going wrong with their nervous system. And others had been obviously suffering a long and slow death as well. So the manner of deaths firstly, it's very concerning and terribly worrying. And then secondly, it starts to give you some clues as to what this could be. Gives you a bit of an idea. If elephants are dying very rapidly, some of them, and others are dying in a manner that's showing neuronal dysfunction, we've got some kind of, be it a pathogen, a poison, a toxin, whatever it is, that's affecting the nervous system. So the investigator in us all starts to then home in on what this could be. So quite quickly, poaching, direct poaching, was ruled out. Poaching with spears or with guns. And there's two easy ways to rule that out. Firstly, there were no wounds on any of the animals that were being found. Quite a few of these animals were dying in really close proximity to some of the human populations in Saronga. And there were no wounds on those animals at all. And then secondly, the ivory was all intact. So no one had gone in to pick the ivory up. And sometimes poachers wait a while to do that, but pretty rarely. The reason they do wait is it takes quite a while for the decomposition of the body to continue sufficiently that you can just pull the ivories out and pull the tusks out. For the first kind of 2 to 3 weeks, the ivory is really stuck in there, and you have to go in with an axe or a chainsaw and cause really quite horrific damage, like the type of thing you can see in this photograph here, to get the ivory out of the elephant's face. Whereas after 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks, decomposition has happened to an extent that with a bit of jiggling, you can get the ivory out and make yourself weigh. So that means you can retrieve the ivory subtly without drawing attention to yourself with axe chops or a chainsaw. And also you don't need to carry such heavy equipment in. A lot of the poachers that are poaching elephants in that part of the Okavango are coming over from Zambia. It's quite a long way. They've got to coming over the river and walking a long way through the delta. And to do that with a chainsaw and a load of axes, as well as all their other supplies, it's difficult. So leaving the elephants to decompose and then taking them was a prospect. But direct poaching through weaponry was ruled out very, very quickly. What that doesn't rule out is poisoning, of course. So if we move on to what's the next slide telling us? So poisoning is a real option. There's two main suspects that could be involved in poisoning. Firstly, it's poachers, and poachers might be wanting to poison these elephants and then collect the ivory afterwards. Again, it's odd that they would leave it a while, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. The reason I started to think it probably wasn't poisoning by poachers was because the main poison used in that region is cyanide. Cyanide stays active in your system for about 72 hours. So there's secondary effects. Scavengers and anything else that would feed on those carcasses would also be killed. And we just weren't seeing that. We were seeing nothing of that sort at all. The other types of people that would want to kill elephants are local farmers, local agriculturalists, because elephants are a nightmare to live next to. It's easy for me living here in Cardiff, where if I'm unlucky, I'll bump into a badger on an evening. But human-wildlife conflict in southern Africa and in Botswana, and in the Saronga Pan in particular, is incredibly difficult. It's at kind of epidemic level, really. You've got a human population which is almost the same as the elephant population, 16,000 elephants, 16,000 people. You've got 4,000 goats, you've got 25,000 cows, all in this area. There's the possibility of disease transfer between the species. Elephants raise your crops. Elephants have got a sweet tooth. And they come in and they will trash a farmer's entire livelihood. A year's earnings could disappear overnight if the elephants come and raid. And so understandably, lots of the people that live next to elephants don't really like the fact that they live next to elephants. It seems romantic to me, or well, not me, because I work in Southern Africa, but to people living here in the UK, the idea of living next to elephants, there's a romance to it, an ideal. It seems wonderful. But the reality is that elephants will smash your fence down, break into your land, break down your house, eat a year's supply of crops, and then bugger off. And that's just what they do, because they weigh 6 or 7 tons. They're incredibly intelligent. They can do exactly what they want. It's very difficult to keep them out if they want to get in. And so human-wildlife conflict in this area is real. It's a very real problem. And people do retributive killings. And poison is one of the things that they will use. Again, cyanide is typically used, but there are other poisons, stuff like aluminium phosphide, which don't have secondary effects. They only affect whatever it is that's ingested them. So poison shouldn't be ruled out even at this stage, just in case poachers or angry local agriculturalists have used a poison that doesn't have a secondary effect. But still, for me, because there's no scavengers dying, I was starting to think that it probably isn't a poison. Probably, and I hope not, because it's sinister and it'd be unpleasant. So then another theory is this starvation? There's a lot of people in Southern Africa that want it to be starvation. It's an ideological position that people have taken up, is that there's too many elephants in Africa. And firstly, that's simply wrong. There's not too many elephants in Africa. There were 26 million not that long ago. It's a total lack of imagination about what Africa should look like. They're looking at Africa through the lens of when they were born, what we call the shifting baseline syndrome. For me, the number of birds that I see out my window is normal to me because that's what I've always seen. But for my grandparents, the number of birds outside this window is a fraction of what it should be. Africa's elephants, as we saw in the graph before, the population's been declining steadily since whites first came to the continent. There's not too many elephants in Botswana. Human-elephant conflict is a problem, absolutely. But that's not because there's too many elephants. It's because we cannot yet come to terms with living next to animals that are as invasive as elephants. Or, to be honest, let's put it back on us. There are too many people on the planet taking up the space that was traditionally an elephant space. Those elephants have been using migratory routes for generations, hundreds, thousands of years. They've been using these routes. And now if a person puts a field of maize a couple of kilometers away from their traditional migratory route, absolutely they're going to go and raid that. And that doesn't detract at all from the tragedy, the human tragedy of an elephant family eating someone's entire yearly crop. What it means is that we have to come to terms. We have to come up with ways of coexisting with these animals. And just shooting them is not a good way of doing it. Culling is not an appropriate mechanism for the 21st century. We know too much about elephant intelligence, and we know too much about the contribution that elephants make to the ecosystem for us to be even countenancing the idea of culling. We have to find ways of coexisting. But starvation is an interesting one, because despite people's ideology, and the fact that they desperately want it to be starvation, they want some proof that there's too many elephants. There's absolutely none. Starvation does a few things. Firstly, starvation happens in the dry season. It's not the dry season. March, April, May, when this first started, is not the dry season. The Okavango Delta is full of water, full of good forage. You can see from this photograph, it's full of good forage. The other thing that starvation does is it emaciates animals. Animals get thin and bony. Look at this. This animal is in great condition. When we've seen starvation happening, as does happen quite often, recently in Wangi last year, we lost a lot of elephants to starvation. Mana Pools as well in Zimbabwe lost a lot recently. They get emaciated. You can see that their hip girdles, their pelvic girdle, they look ill. And these elephants dying in the Delta aren't looking ill. The other thing that starvation does, which is particularly telling and not evident here at all, is that it takes old and young individuals preferentially. First animals to die when there's a lack of resources are the weakest, which is you're old and you're young. But this isn't happening in the Delta. Animals of all ages and both genders are dying in equal numbers, it seems. So despite people's huge desire for it to be an overpopulation of elephants, it's not an overpopulation of elephants, and it's not starvation. We can say that categorically.
Now, I just used this image as an example. These are actually from Zimbabwe to show that what starving elephants might look like, but these are not the Botswana elephants.
Yeah, Zimbabwe's had multiple droughts over the last few years. Wangi and Mana Pools have had particularly significant die-offs of elephants in the last few years as a result of droughts. And as you can see, it has a very significant impact on the body shape of elephants before they finally succumb. There was a very serious die-off, before I go on to natural toxins, in the 1970s in Tsavo National Park in Kenya. and around 6,000 elephants died. But that was over the course of a couple of years of a prolonged drought. And in terms of numbers, that's the only single event that I know of that's larger than this. But of course, it took place over such a prolonged period. It's very, very different. So then we look at natural toxins in the water or in the soil. One of the stats which has been oft repeated is that 70% of the carcasses were seen near waterholes. Now that's not necessarily surprising, because elephants need to drink a lot. They need to eat between 100 and 200 kilos of food a day, and they drink a vast amount of water. So that they are near waterholes anyway. That's what they do. So you would expect to see more dying near waterholes. But the state of some of these waterholes, as in this one, indicates that there might well be harmful algal blooms. What harmful algal blooms can do is be populated, those algae populated by cyanobacteria or other harmful algae, which have neurotoxic properties. So that can then create neurotoxicosis. And I would say that neurotoxicosis is one of the strongest candidates for what's potentially killing these elephants here. The trouble with neurotoxicosis is that it's incredibly difficult to actually detect. To sample for this, there's very few signatures left actually in the bodies of the animals themselves. So it requires environmental sampling, soil samples, water samples, and that type of thing. But then to identify it is also difficult. You can use PCR, so polymerase chain reaction, to try and increase the amount of DNA in your sample to then identify the specific species of cyanobacteria that might be causing this. But again, you've got to know what species you're looking for, and it's much easier said than done. There's other ways of doing it. Kind of, if you diffract through chromatography and separate the different layers and try and identify different constituent parts of your sample. But again, that's difficult, and not that many labs regionally have that capacity. Some do in South Africa. So it's not easy to find at all. So yeah, high performance liquid chromatography is what people tend to use to try and identify cyanobacteria, but it's difficult. But I would say it's a very real prospect. I wouldn't be surprised if it ended up being algal blooms, so cyanobacteria. The issue with that is it can come and go, and it's exacerbated by global warming. So these blooms happen because of extra heating events, and they tend to happen in the dry season, and they get worse and worse as the planet warms up. These are going to happen more, and we see them all across the world, and loads of different species are affected. Marine mammals, whales and dolphins and seals are affected. Dogs, people's pet dogs, are frequently affected by algal blooms, and we've seen it in wildlife as well, and in elephants and other wild species in southern Africa, South Africa in particular. This type of thing has happened before. It's just very difficult to detect. My guess is whatever this is going to come back. So even if we don't find out what it is immediately, I think it's vital that we still leave no stone unturned to identify what it is that's killing them, so we can predict if it's going to happen again and try and mitigate it somehow. And also, if this happens in a different population, the Botswana population is big, and even though 400 elephants is a lot of elephants, that population can absorb that amount just with natural growth rates, whereas smaller isolated populations in other parts of the continent could not absorb that level of die-off. So it's vital that we identify what this is, so we can potentially mitigate it having a negative impact on other populations further around as well. So natural toxins is a very real possibility. One of the things that initially put me off thinking it was natural toxins was the fact that no other animals are dying. And you'd expect, certainly with anthrax. Anthrax is a common, naturally occurring toxin in the area. Botswana lost 100 elephants last year to anthrax. Zimbabwe loses elephants to anthrax all the time, but other species die as well. You can rule out anthrax easily, really, because you get hemorrhages from your orifices. So you bleed out of your anus and other orifices. And also animals that die from anthrax die with their heads up and their legs outstretched. So it's really quite obvious when an animal has died from anthrax because of the hemorrhaging and the body position. But then you'd have other animals dying as well. And if you look at this photograph, there's two vultures there that are absolutely fine. And if they were feeding on a poisoned or an animal that succumbed to a natural toxin like anthrax, you'd expect them to die. But the funny thing about neurotoxins, bizarre things, is that they can have differential effects on different individuals. So not just between species, but within species. If we look recently at a very famous, in the UK at least, human neurotoxic agent attack, there was an attack on former Russian agents in Salisbury. And him and his daughter were poisoned with a neurotoxin. They received a massive dose, and yet somehow they managed to survive. Whereas other people receiving a much, much smaller dose don't survive these things. It's quite remarkable that the breadth of response that people or animals within a species can have to neurotoxins. And it seems to be because of the lack or the presence of a paroxynase enzyme. If you have a lot of paroxynase, then you're much more likely to survive a neurotoxic event than if you have little of it. But that's just one of those many additional confusing elements to add to this particularly confusing situation. So then you're looking at pathogens. Is it a disease of some form, a virus? So you've got, in terms of diseases, we can think of viruses or bacteria as being the most likely. So within viruses, one candidate which came up repeatedly is encephalomyocarditis. And the reason that came up was because there were some deaths in Kruger National Park in South Africa between 1993 and 1994. And quite a few elephants, almost exclusively adult males, it was over 80% of the deaths were adult males, were dying of this encephalomyocarditis. So it's a virus that's infecting the animals, and it comes from rodent excreta. So rodent urine, rodent dung, and then that's getting into the forage. Elephants are eating the forage and are dying of this. But you have lesions on your myocardiums, the lining around your heart, that are quite obvious, and that hasn't been reported by any of the vets that have been visiting this. So although this theory is being strongly supported by lots of people within academia and within conservation, it seems probably unlikely that it's encephalomyocarditis at this stage, just because we would expect to see those lesions. But there are other viruses that it could be as well. So things like West Nile virus is a possibility. Elephants can get that, and other species as well. Equids, horses can get it. That's a mosquito-borne vector. And again, so with pools, that's where the mosquitoes are. So there would be an association with pools if it's that type of virus. So that's another possibility. There's another type of herpes virus, elephant endotheliotropic herpes virus. But that tends to only affect Asian elephants and tends to be young ones. So all of these viral possibilities that have been thrown out, they're strong contenders, but there's things suggesting that it probably isn't that. Then you've got a bunch of potential bacteria that it could be as well. So Clostridium or Pasteurella. Clostridium, that creates the exact types of motor dysfunction that we've been witnessing. So loss of motor function of your limbs, walking in tight circles. That's classic Clostridium. But Clostridium also gives you diarrhea, and these elephants aren't having diarrhea. So it's probably not that. Well, then Pasteurella, which killed huge numbers of Saiga antelope, the extraordinary antelope with a trunk, which lives in Central Asia. And like a quarter of the entire species disappeared overnight. A few years ago, there's been 2 big die-offs, and that ended up being Pasteurella, which normally exists benignly in the population, but because of global heating, it reached a certain tipping point and had a massive lethal effect on all ages. So that's another possibility as well. But then there's the possibility that this is a novel pathogen, something that we don't yet know. And that's even more, I suppose, concerning and difficult. Something like a coronavirus, COVID-19. Coronaviruses are well known, but COVID-19 is a new one. And people have said to me, well, what if it's COVID? Well, it could be, but it probably isn't, because COVID-19 is a respiratory virus, principally, and these animals appear to be suffering neuronal dysfunction. And then you've got to think, is there a transmission pathway? Can elephants catch a disease that people have? Well, they've caught tuberculosis before from people. We know that there's a transmission pathway for some diseases between people and elephants. But COVID-19 hasn't really been recorded in that part of Botswana. Botswana in general has done incredibly well at containing COVID-19, and that northwestern region hasn't had it at all. So despite obvious concerns, I'd say it probably isn't COVID, or almost definitely. But of course it's worrying. And what COVID does do is it focuses our minds on the effect of habitat degradation and our treatment of wildlife and the knock-on impact that has on humanity. And yeah, here we are with 2/3 of all emerging infectious diseases coming from wildlife, and that's normally on the where there's an interface between humans and people. So forest edges where we're deforesting, and the wildlife trade is a massive exacerbator of that. COVID-19 has demonstrated this. So then the next thing to think about is precedent. Is there a precedent to this? Has this happened before? We have the deaths that I mentioned before in Tsavo in the late 1970s, which was more elephants, 6,000. That's a significant number. Again, that population in Tsavo was able to absorb that, but it took place over a 2 to 3 year period, and it was exacerbated by drought. It was a drought-related disease, so very, very different. What we've got here is essentially someone's clicked their fingers and 400 elephants have died, essentially, and that we haven't seen before. So we have seen anthrax die-offs, which have killed significant numbers. 2018, 2019, Botswana and Zimbabwe have suffered significant losses of elephants, tens, dozens, reaching 100. But for 400 elephants, thereabouts, to die in what is essentially the blinking of an eyelid, for unknown reasons, totally unrelated to drought, is unknown, it's unprecedented. And I think something that many people forget, certainly the people that want it to be overpopulation forget, is that the impact that this is having on the rest of the herd must be enormous. Elephants have a brain 4 times the size of ours. They cry salt tears. They mourn their dead. They have incredibly strong family bonds. They are unbelievably sociable. They care about their relatives. Whenever you visit the carcass of an elephant, which I've been, I don't know, lucky or unlucky, either way, I've been to many, there's footprints of other elephants everywhere because they come and they mourn their dead. They pay respect to their ancestors. This photograph's extraordinary, laying its trunk on its dead relative. Unbelievable. And can you imagine the impact of 400 of your friends and family just dropping dead and you don't know why? Like, elephants that are stressed out by high levels of killing and human-wildlife conflict become more aggressive. One of my concerns about this is that this population of elephants is going to be very, very stressed because they've just witnessed 400 of their fellow elephants dying. And stressed elephants are more likely to be aggressive. We've already got a situation in that part of Botswana where there's a lot of human-wildlife conflict. And I'm worried that this will exacerbate that. But just from the elephant's perspective, this must be appalling. I spoke to someone very recently who's just been back to the area, and he flew over the area 2 days ago and told me he saw 8 elephants, which I find just extraordinary, because a few weeks ago there were thousands of elephants there, and now there are 8. All of the others they've fled. They're obviously terrified. Look, Botswana already is housing refugee elephants. If you look at all of the countries around Botswana and the losses that they have suffered as a result of poaching, in particular Angola and Zambia, terrible, terrible losses from poaching. So many of the elephants that live in northern Botswana, their ancestors were from the neighboring countries, and they have sought refuge in Botswana because Botswana was safe. And for the time being, many of those, the corridors that lead back into those countries are still unsafe. Elephants respond to human pressure by getting out of there. If the poaching is high somewhere, elephants leave. The elephants have fled this area as a result of 400 of their number dying. And I find that it's a tragic thought, but it's also an extraordinary thought because it yet further demonstrates that they know what's happening. They know what's happening around them. and they know that this is awful and we've got to get out of here. And so they've scarpered, and that they'll come back, I'm sure. But goodness, yeah, absolutely awful what they're doing. So what's the current status? Well, we know that the government of Botswana have started to engage multilaterally with other nations. So there are labs in Botswana, but there's limited capacity to test for the huge diversity of things that we're having to test for. Because we've kind of scratched the surface. I've named a few viruses and bacteria and toxins, etc., that it could be, but I've barely scratched the surface. And really, it's like searching for a needle in a haystack. And we may never know what's killing these elephants. But I ideally hope we do, because we need to be able to see it off the next time it happens. And if it happens somewhere else, to a more vulnerable population, it's vital that we know what's doing this. But we've got labs in Zimbabwe that are very well capacitated. Very, very talented pathologists there, vets. Lab in South Africa, lab in Canada, the United States and the United Kingdom have also offered support. So again, that demonstrates for me the international significance of this. And I think it took the government of Botswana a little while to realize that what's happening there, it's not a criticism of them, the fact that these elephants are dying. There's international concern, and people want to offer support and encouragement. And so the number of emails I have received of people wanting to help in some way, saying, what can I do? And it's amazing that that's happened, but it's also great that it's happened at government level. So you've got government level delegations from the United Kingdom, the United States, speaking to the Botswana government to try and find a solution. Unfortunately, it's going to be incredibly difficult to find that solution, because sampling is a problem. In a place that's hot, that's difficult to get to, it's very hard to get timely, accurate samples. And when you don't know what you're looking for, you've got to sample everything. We need samples of the environment. We need brain tissue, blood, stomach contents, liver, spleen. You need absolutely everything. And to do that is difficult. To then have the correct reagents is difficult, because some of those need to be frozen. Some of those need to be in formalin. It's a whole combination of things that need to be done. And then they need to be transported. Trying to do international transport in the age of coronavirus is easier said than done. To get these samples across just to Zimbabwe is difficult, let alone getting them out of the continent to the US, to Canada, to the United Kingdom. Coronavirus has been a seriously negatively exacerbating feature of this whole problem. So we may never know, because to try and find out what it is so difficult. What I think is desperately needed is for the recipient labs to provide very, very stringent instructions of how to sample for the most obvious candidates of what this is going to be. And then Botswana is very well capacitated in terms of vets. Very, very high level of veterinary cover in that country, very good level of education. And there certainly is the capacity to be able to take those samples. But each lab, depending on its speciality, needs to provide very precise, stringent instructions as to how to sample for us to have the best opportunity of stopping this. So are the deaths still taking place? Thankfully, no. So I was very worried, especially after the second survey in June, because so many animals were still seen to be suffering motor dysfunction. It was likely that they were going to succumb, and they may well have done, because it's not easy to spot dead elephants from the air, as I've said. But there have been surveys now. The government did one 2 weeks ago with a partner organisation, EcoExist, and they didn't spot any. And there's been a couple of other local NGOs go out and have a look, and carcasses are no longer being found. So I'm thrilled about that, because I was worried that entire population of 15,000 could be affected. That's a tenth of Botswana's entire herd that could have been affected and killed by this, because it seems to be killing indiscriminately. So the fact that it stopped is great. Will this happen again? I would say almost definitely yes. Whatever this is, if it's a pathogen or if it's a toxin of some form, if it's a poison even, it's going to happen again. And Climate change, of course, is your threat multiplier. The world is warming up, and things like cyanobacteria are becoming more and more common as a result of a warming planet. Many of these new emerging infectious diseases are happening because we're breaking into areas that were formerly pristine. COVID-19 has taught us that, but so has Ebola, SARS, HIV, rabies, H1N1. All of these diseases, with COVID-19 at the tip of the spear, have taught us that we must change our relationship with nature. Our relationship with nature is broken, and we've got to change. We've got to stop breaking into these natural habitats, releasing pandemics, but also setting off a cascade of negative impacts on the planet. Australia burns to a crisp this year, and that should not be happening. The Arctic is melting as we speak. It was 38 degrees in Siberia 2 weeks ago. That is madness. We must put value on natural ecosystems, because we need thriving natural ecosystems to have a thriving human society. When it comes to sub-Saharan Africa, elephants are probably your most significant landscape architects. They have a greater impact on the world around them than any other animal in that landscape, which makes them the most important. It makes them the keystone architects of our landscapes. We need natural ecosystems. We need clean air. We need clean water. We need pollination services. We need all of the ecosystem services that are delivered to us from intact landscapes. So we must protect them. And what COVID-19 has demonstrated is that we can't just rely on tourism to fund conservation. It's madness. It's a house of cards. That's conservation, the environment, which is the most important thing on Earth. Over 50% of global GDP is either highly or moderately dependent upon the natural world. The most important thing on Earth is currently propped up by tourism. That's madness. It's total madness. It should be central to our international budgets and our domestic budgets. So how can we help? Well, vote. Vote for sensible politicians that put the environment first is the first thing you can do. But then vote with your feet. Visit national parks. Go to Botswana, and by visiting Botswana, visiting the Delta, visiting Chobe National Park and other national parks around the world, you are demonstrating with your tourist dollars that these areas matter. So you're putting a value to their heads. But it needs to go beyond that as well. We need to start understanding that we need these intact ecosystems. And to do that, we need to change policy. How do we change policy? You get governments to change policy. Your representative, your MP, your senator, congressperson, it's literally their job to represent you in Parliament. So write to them, go and see them, drop them a line, tell them how important this issue is to you, because they have to represent you. Tell your friends and family, if this matters to you, if you're on this webinar, this matters to you. And therefore it should matter to other people as well. To speak to your neighbours about this situation, not just about elephants, but about our relationship with the planet in general. Voting, encouraging people around you is the most important thing we can do, and share these stories. Share them far and wide. Social media is an unbelievable tool for generating interest and momentum. Look at what can happen with a little girl sat on the doorstep of her school once every Friday in Sweden. Suddenly, the entire world is going on strike for climate as a result of one girl by herself sat there in Sweden. Because people found out about it with social media. You could be the next Greta Thunberg by doing something. Get out there and make a difference and use social media as a weapon. It's a massive tool to share these stories widely. In the UK, if you get 100,000 signatures on a petition, government have to talk about it in Parliament. Other countries will have similar rules as well. To sign petitions, get them started. We've got to have the environment front and centre on domestic and international policy, because human society needs it, but because it's the right thing to do as well.
Thank you, Niall. That was incredible. Really inspiring and moving, should I just add. If any of you have questions, please will you put them in the question and answer section, and we'll try and moderate. I know we've got about 10 odd minutes, and if you would want to spend a little bit more time with us, we'll try and get to as many as we can. Now, a couple coming in. The first question, I know you briefly talked about poisons. Do you think plants, you talked about algae blooms, were there any plants that this could be the result?
It could be. Now, of course, elephants evolved in this landscape, so they've evolved to know which plants are toxic and which aren't, but people bring plants in with them. And like the most famous example in Africa is Lantana camara. It's a beautiful garden plant from Mexico, and people brought it in for their lovely colonial houses. And of course, it's then spread widely, and it's doing now incredibly well, especially in East Africa, but it's in Zimbabwe, I know, and some various other places. And it's highly toxic to cows and other species, hindgut fermenters in particular. So there is a precedent for people bringing plants in. So if it's a plant, it would almost definitely have to be one that's been imported. I wouldn't rule that out. It's another important thing to look at. Again, we've got a large human population. Many of those will have gardens. Many of them will have imported plants into it. It's worth investigating.
And do you think you mentioned briefly that the world is trying to help Botswana, but it seems like it took a long time for the ball to get rolling. And just on top of that, people want to know, are there boots on the ground right now? Have we contained that area, not just doing the census flyovers and the sampling? How do we make sure that this doesn't keep happening? Could you answer?
Yeah, so two questions there, really. So yes, it took a long time to get started, and there's lots of reasons for that. I think firstly, we must give the government of Botswana a little bit of slack. They're dealing with a global pandemic in the same way as all of us are, and trying to mobilize resources at a time when you're trying to lock down a population and deal with a disease like COVID-19 is very difficult. Secondly, I don't think they necessarily realized how significant this was. I think they probably thought it was a domestic issue. And there's a lot of people in Botswana that are, to be honest, pretty thrilled that 400 elephants have died, because it's 400 fewer elephants that are going to go and trash their fields. So they wouldn't have really minded. And with this administration in particular, I think it's worth emphasizing the lengths that they have wanted to go to demonstrate to the rural population of Botswana that they don't put the lives of elephants before the lives of people. Because there was often an accusation levied against the previous administration that they put conservation before people. And at a time when people are struggling to access healthcare or get access to education, when a government is investing resources in what people think is just elephant protection, that can create discontent. Let me put it that way, create discontent in rural populations. And so the current administration probably didn't want to be seen to be investing in what was seen as an elephant issue at a time when they're dealing with a global pandemic. What I want to emphasize is that this isn't necessarily just an elephant issue. If it's a disease, there's the possibility of zoonosis, like we've seen with COVID. If it's a toxin or a poison, there's also the possibility of it spilling over into human populations. And we've got 16,000 people live there that rely on that area for their water and for their forage and everything else. So it is potentially a human issue, but even if it's not, even if it is just a wildlife issue, we know how important that is. We must support our environment. We have to prop up our natural ecosystems, because we need those ecosystems intact for our own well-being.
I'm getting quite a few questions coming through here. David wants to know, is botulism possible?
Yes, botulism is another possibility, and again has neuronal effects. So that's one that needs to be looked at very closely, and I know the labs are considering it.
Great. I'm just trying to multitask here and look at the questions and talk to you at the same time.
And I failed to answer your previous question about boots on the ground. So combination of things. The human population there, the villagers are quite vigilant anyway. They have been warned not to scavenge from these carcasses, just in case there's any toxin. Because normally, if you find a dead elephant, great, it's a load of food. But they've been told not to eat from these carcasses. They're also vigilant in that area. There is then a greater presence of anti-poaching forces, so the BDF as well. So there are boots on the ground, but lots of the elephants still do have their ivory, which is remarkable. I think it's probably, well, it's difficult to access, and to try and find 400 carcasses and get their ivory is going to be tough, but it's worth doing, because that's going to be a magnet for criminals.
I know you've quickly talked about COVID, but another person here has asked, can elephants actually get it? I mean, I suppose we don't know yet.
We don't yet know. We do know that cats can get it. We know that mink can get it. So we know that there is a pathway between people and other mammals, and vice versa. So because we got it from a mammal initially, probably started off in a bat reservoir, and then potentially through a pangolin, could be a different one, and then into people. So we know that transmission pathway does exist. The reason I think it's probably not COVID, partially, there's no proof that it gets in elephants, but then also COVID just isn't in that part of the world at the moment, in northwestern Botswana, and what is killing them doesn't appear to be a respiratory disease.
Simon here, I think he's asked, you mentioned that the elephants were fleeing that area. They obviously haven't fled Botswana as such. They've just moved to another area of Botswana. Is that correct? Have they just moved out of that area? And what can be done to protect elephants and reduce the impact on crops and people in the next area?
Oh, I'm worried that that's what's going to happen, is that it's only going to get worse for human-elephant conflict because of this. So firstly, the elephants have fled where they're dying, and they can't go very far because half of that area is surrounded by a veterinary fence, and the other half is cut off by the Okavango River, which is deep and wide. So the elephants are pretty well confined in there. It's almost they're unnaturally confined in there, really, which is why the population has got quite high. So I am concerned that it's going to increase human-wildlife conflict, human-elephant conflicts. And as I've specified, stressed elephants are more aggressive elephants, and that is a concern. The fact that they fled, there's less area for them to go, so they will go to people more likely into fields, and they're more likely to be stressed and aggressive as a result.
So a question from Morgan, who's a young girl. She asked, in one of the pictures, you showed an elephant that looked quite bloated and swollen. Is this just part of the natural dying process, or is this part of the problem with what that elephant has? Could you just speak a bit?
It's much more likely to be just a part of the natural dying process. So when anything dies, they fill up with gas. That's why bodies that die underwater often then come to the surface after a few days as they slowly fill with gas. So if you've ever been near an elephant carcass, you'll know how much they smell, and you don't want them to go pop. It's pretty unpleasant.
And is this place quite remote? I mean, what's going to happen to all these carcasses? Are they going to be burned to make sure that they're not transmitting further illnesses, or what is happening? Because, I mean, they're all dotted around, aren't they?
They are. So those carcasses that are closest to human habitation have already been burnt and buried, and that was important that happened so quickly. Some of them are very remote. But I think it's important that they're still located and that the ivory be taken at the very least, just because otherwise you're attracting international criminality to that area when you've got so much ivory lying around. But yeah, burning and burying the carcasses has happened and is continuing.
I think we've run out of time, but I'm going to see if I can quickly ask a couple more. Is the best thing for us to do at the moment, obviously sharing this is going to be recorded, but are you saying to go to each of our MPs and sort of badger them and write to them? What is the easiest thing that you recommend that we can do at
So the very easiest thing that you can do just by lifting your finger is sharing this story and other stories that are about it. And we've seen that this story went viral. An article in The Guardian, which is read only by a few hundred left-wing people here in the UK, suddenly went all the way around the world and was picked up by everyone. So it's very easy for a story to go viral. And when a story is as emotive as this, the world cares. The world really cares what's happening to Botswana's elephants. So get out there and share it. But then if you want to do more, get on the case of your local politician. Write to them. Or go and see them even. Most of them, they'll have local surgeries where you get to go and see them on a weekend. Do that. Take some responsibility. But we've all got social networks that we can impact, be that friends or family, and I'd encourage you to do that.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. The fact that a few hundred people have just joined and been part of this, and even though the story is now a few weeks old, just shows that we do care deeply. And on behalf of all these people, I just want to thank you for being so passionate, for doing what you're doing, for being the voice, and keep doing what you're doing and keep us posted on what goes on, and we will share and help as much as we can. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Keep well.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.